Sister-in-law handed me a name tag at the door like I was a vendor who'd shown up to the wrong event. "Just so people know who you are," she said, smiling with all her teeth, "we have a lot of important guests tonight." I looked down at the sticker. It said, Cassie, Nolan's little sister. Not my job, not my company, not even my full name, just whose little sister I was. I peeled the backing off and pressed it onto my blouse anyway, because what else do? You smile. You walk in. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. It did matter, though. It always did with my family. My brother Nolan had been riding high for the past 2 years on a real estate development deal that was finally closing. A mixed-use property in downtown Charlotte he'd been pitching to investors since before I graduated college. Tonight was his celebration dinner, the kind with rented venue space and a bartender in a vest and little appetizers that cost more per bite than my hourly rate used to. Used to. That's the part my family didn't know about. I'll back up. I'm 31 years old. For most of my 20s, I worked as a licensed electrician. First as an apprentice, then journeyman. Then I got my contractor's license at 27. My family was never exactly embarrassed by this, but they were never proud either. My mom would answer, "What does Cassie do?" at church with, "Oh, she does electrical work." In the same tone, she might say, "She's going through a phase." My dad was more direct. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, he told me, in front of my aunt and 2 cousins, that he worried I'd priced myself out of meeting someone because apparently men don't want to date women who can rewire a circuit panel. I laughed. He didn't. Nolan was the one they talked about. Nolan was the one who wore suits to dinner and said things like cap rate and yield optimization and watched my parents' eyes light up like he was reading from scripture. What none of them knew was that for the past 3 years, while I was running my electrical contracting business, I quietly started buying rental properties. Small ones at first. A duplex in Greensboro, a single family in Gastonia I picked up at auction for $62,000 and rented out within 3 weeks. Then 2 more, then a small commercial strip with 4 units. I rewired the whole thing myself, which saved me about $40,000 in contractor fees, which I rolled right back into the next deal. By the time Nolan's celebration dinner rolled around, I owned 11 properties outright, or nearly outright, had 1 commercial building under a 30-year fixed, and my net rental income was running about $19,000 a month. I had not told my family any of this, not because I was hiding it exactly, more because no one had ever asked. When you're the sibling who does electrical work, people tend to stop asking follow-up questions. The venue was a private room at a steakhouse in uptown Charlotte. Dark wood, leather chairs, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they're in a cologne advertisement. There were maybe 40 people, investors, attorneys, Nolan's business partners, some city council contacts he'd been cultivating. My mother found me near the bar and hugged me with one arm, which is her version of a full embrace when she's in professional mode. "You came," she said, like this was a surprise. "He's my brother." "Of course." "Yes." She looked past me to check who was nearby. "You look nice. That blouse is very practical." I was wearing a silk blouse and tailored trousers. I'd gotten my hair done that morning. "But okay. Try the shrimp," she said, and drifted towards someone more important. I got a glass of wine and found a spot near the window. Outside, the city skyline was doing its thing. Banking towers lit up, a few cranes still visible from the construction boom that had made Nolan's deal possible. I knew this area. I pulled permits in 3 of those buildings. I'd stood on job sites 6 blocks from here, in steel-toed boots, at 6 in the morning arguing with general contractors about load capacity. "Cassie." Nolan appeared at my elbow. He was already a little flushed, the way he gets when he's been receiving compliments for an hour. "Glad you made it." "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it. "Big deal." 8 figures, he said, and I could see him deciding whether to say the number out loud. He said it. 12.4, final close. "That's huge, Nolan." "Really?" He nodded, accepting this as his due. "Well, really?" He nodded, accepting this as his due. Then he glanced around, actually checked to see who was in earshot, and leaned in slightly. "Listen, I know this crowd is a little heavy. Just maybe don't get too deep into the trade stuff with anyone, okay? These are finance guys. They don't really—" He waved a hand. "You know." I looked at him for a moment. I'll be on my best behavior, I said. He gave me a relieved smile and moved on. That was the moment I decided to just watch, not do anything, not correct anyone, just observe. And what I observed over the next 90 minutes was interesting. Nolan worked the room like a man who'd been practicing this for years because he had. He was good at it. The handshake that pulled you in slightly, the eye contact that made you feel chosen, the self-deprecating joke that wasn't really self-deprecating. I'd grown up watching him do this at family dinners, at school functions, at church. He was the kind of person who made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. The investors seemed happy. There was a lot of backslapping, a toast with good bourbon. But I kept watching, because I'd been in enough business settings by that point to know what confident looks like versus what performing confident looks like. And Nolan was performing. His jaw was tight in a way it only got when he was stressed. He was drinking faster than everyone else but spacing it out so no one noticed. When one of the lead investors, an older man in a grey suit I'd heard someone call Mr. Farrell, pulled him aside near the far wall and spoke quietly for about 4 minutes, Nolan's smile didn't move, but his left hand went into his pocket and didn't come back out. I've done enough work in enough buildings to know when a structure is load-bearing and when it's decorative. I was looking at a decorative wall. After dinner, I found myself seated next to a woman named Paula who worked in commercial lending. We got talking. She asked what I did, and I told her, electrical contractor, own my own business, some property on the side. What kind of property? She asked. I told her. She put down her fork. How many units total? Across all the properties. 31. 2 commercial, the rest residential. And you self-manage? The residential, yes. I have a property manager for the commercial. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I'd gotten a few times from people in finance, a recalibration, like when you've been reading a map upside down and you finally flip it. How old are you? 31. And your brother doesn't know about any of this. My family thinks I fix wiring. She laughed, a real one. Honey, you are fixing wiring, the wiring of your entire financial future. It was later that night, near the end of the dinner, that things shifted. My dad had cornered me by the dessert table. He was on his 3rd bourbon, which is when he starts saying things he believes are helpful. You know, tonight seeing all this? He gestured broadly at the room. This is what hard work looks like. This is what happens when you think big. It's a good night for Nolan, I said. It could have been you, Cassie. That's what I'm saying, you're smart. You've just been small thinking. The electrical thing, it's fine, it pays the bills. But Dad, I just want more for you. Your mother and I, we lie awake sometimes, Dad. I'm fine. He patted my shoulder with the heavy kindness of someone who's certain they're right. I know you think you are, sweetheart. I looked at my father, this man who loved me in the way that felt more like concern than confidence, who had wanted big things for me but couldn't see them because they didn't look like what he recognized as big. And I made a decision. I didn't say anything that night, but I made the decision. 3 weeks later, I got a call from my mother. Her voice had that quality it gets when something is wrong, but she's not ready to say what. We talked around it for a few minutes, the weather, my aunt's knee surgery, a neighbor's dog, and then she said, your brother needs some help. What kind of help? Silence. Mom, what happened? What happened was this. The deal had closed, but not cleanly. One of the investors had pulled out 6 days before closing, which had created a gap Nolan had plugged with a short-term bridge loan at terms that were, to put it charitably, aggressive. He'd assumed he could refinance within 60 days. He had not been able to refinance within 60 days. He had not been able to refinance within 60 days. The lender, a private equity group out of Atlanta, was now accelerating the debt. They wanted the money, and they wanted it fast. There was more. The kind of more that accumulates when someone has been moving fast and not looking down. He'd borrowed against my parents' house. 2 years ago, when a deal fell through, he'd needed a quick infusion and my dad had co-signed a HELOC. My parents had $41,000 of equity left in a home they'd owned for 26 years. The rest was gone. How much does he need? I asked. My mother quoted me a number. I was quiet for a moment. Does he know you're calling me? No. Okay. I exhaled. I need a few days. Don't tell him I know. I want to be clear about what happened next, because this is the part people get wrong when they tell this kind of story. The fantasy version is that I swept in with a briefcase full of cash and made a speech, and everyone cried and learned their lesson. That is not what happened. What happened was that I called my attorney, a woman named Faye who handles my property deals, and we spent 2 days going through the paperwork Nolan's situation had generated. What I found, buried in the documents, was something that made my stomach drop. The HELOC. My dad had co-signed. Nolan had used it as collateral on a second loan, a separate private loan not from a bank that my parents didn't know about and hadn't signed off on. Someone had gotten their signatures on a document they believed was a routine refinance disclosure. My dad's signature on something he hadn't understood. Faye said the word fraud in the same flat tone she uses for all serious things. And I sat with that for a moment in my car in a parking garage in Concord, with my hands on the steering wheel and the engine off. My brother, who I had loved, and in many ways still loved, because love is not a switch, had stolen from our parents. Not out of malice, maybe, not with full premeditation, but he had seen a problem, and he had solved it the fast way, the way that didn't require him to say "I'm in trouble" out loud. And the people who paid for that solution were a retired school teacher and a former city planner who had $41,000 left in a house they thought was theirs. I went to see my parents on a Saturday. My mother made coffee and put out a plate of the cookies she keeps in the green tin. My dad sat in his chair in the living room with the television on low. It was such an ordinary Saturday morning, the kind that makes it hard to say the things that need to be said because everything around you is pretending nothing is wrong. I sat down. I put the folder from Faye on the coffee table. "I need to show you something," I said, "and I need you to let me get through all of it before you respond." My dad looked at the folder. My mother's hands went still around her mug. I went through it slowly. The HELOC. The second loan. The signatures. What Faye believed had happened and what it meant legally. My dad didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. My mother was crying quietly, in the way she does when she's trying not to make it about herself. "How did you?" my dad started. "Paula, a woman I met at the dinner. She connected me with someone who could pull the public records." I paused. "And I've been doing this for a while, Dad. I know how to read a deal." "You've been doing what?" So I told them, all of it. The duplex in Greensboro, the auctions, the 11 properties, the $19,000 a month. All the things I'd been doing, quietly, without applause, without anyone calling it impressive at a celebration dinner in a steakhouse with good bourbon. My dad looked at me for a very long time. "Why didn't you tell us?" he finally said. And this is the thing I'd been thinking about for 3 weeks. Since the parking garage, since the night of the dinner, since the name tag at the door. "Because no one asked?" I said. "And because I knew it wouldn't look like anything you recognized until it was big enough to be undeniable. So I waited until it was undeniable." We didn't confront Nolan all at once. Faye advised against it. She wanted to have everything documented and a specific ask ready before we said anything, so there was no room for maneuvering. When we did sit down with him, it was at my parents' house on a Tuesday evening in March, with Faye present and a very specific letter from her firm on the table. Nolan came in expecting a family dinner. He'd texted earlier asking what time, and my mom had said 6. There was a roast chicken in the oven. Everything normal on the surface. He sat down. He saw Faye. He saw the folder. He looked at me. I don't know what expression I had. I was trying very hard to have no expression because I'd cried already, in my car, twice, over the previous 2 weeks, and I'd made a decision that I wasn't going to cry at this table. I was going to be the person who'd read the documents and understood the numbers and knew what came next. That's the version of myself I needed to be right then. "Nogan," Faye said in her flat, careful voice, "we're not here to threaten you. We're here to talk about what's possible." He went pale. He didn't deny it. Not really. Not after the first few minutes of confusion and deflection. He said he'd thought he could fix it before anyone found out. He said he'd been so close, the deal had been so close, and once it closed, he was going to make everything right. He'd had a plan. There was always a plan. My dad sat across from him and listened and didn't say a word. That was the hardest part to watch. My mother left the room once for about 4 minutes and came back with her eyes dry and her chin up. The short version of what happened next: Nolan signed over his interest in the now closed deal to a restructured arrangement that would make my parents whole on the HELOC over the following 18 months. He retained some stake, less than he'd hoped, significantly less, but not nothing. Faye negotiated it in a way that kept things out of court, which was better for everyone, and specifically protected my parents from any further liability on the fraudulent second loan. It took 4 months to fully sort out. There were difficult phone calls. There were a few family dinners that felt like walking on ice. My brother and I didn't speak for about 6 weeks in the middle of it, and when we did start speaking again, it was slowly and carefully, the way you talk when you're testing whether the surface will hold. I want to tell you the moment things started to change, because I think it matters. It was a Sunday in June. My dad called me, which he almost never does. Usually it's my mom who calls, and then hands him the phone when I'm already on the line. He said, "I've been thinking about that duplex you mentioned, the one in Greensboro. Can you walk me through how that worked, the math of it?" So I did. We were on the phone for an hour and a half. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know you knew how to do all that." "I know," I said. "I should have asked." Those 3 words, "I should have asked." From my father, who is not a man who apologizes easily or admits he's missed something. "It's okay, Dad. It's not really. But thank you for..." He stopped. "Thank you for handling it the way you did. I know it wasn't easy. I still have the name tag. I kept it. I don't know exactly why. I'm not a sentimental person, and it's not like it's a trophy. It's just a sticker with my name and a small reminder that I was once, in someone's mind, reducible to whose sister I was. Some nights when I'm going through my books, running the numbers on the next deal, checking occupancy rates, looking at what's coming up at auction, I think about that room, the rented venue, the borrowed swagger, the careful performance of a man who was running out of runway and didn't want anyone to see. I think about how I sat there with my wine and my practical blouse and my name tag and knew things no one thought to ask me about. I think about my dad on the phone in June, wanting to know the math. I think about Paula at the dinner who flipped the map and saw it right side up. The deal I'm closing next month is my 14th property, a small mixed use on the east side of Charlotte, 2 commercial units on the ground floor, 4 residential above. I've already done a walkthrough. The electrical panel is original to 1987 and will need a full replacement. I'm going to do it myself. I still think about the name tag sometimes. Not because it hurt. Well, it did hurt. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but because of what it represented. Someone had decided, without asking a single question, exactly who I was and how much space I was allowed to take up. And the strange thing is, I let it happen for years. Not out of weakness, more out of patience, I think. And maybe a little out of curiosity about how long it would go on before someone thought to ask. Here's what I've come to understand about the way things played out. Nothing that happened was accidental. Not Nolan's collapse, not my parents losing their equity, not the fact that I was the one who found it. Every outcome in that situation was the direct result of choices made over years. Nolan chose speed over honesty, again and again, until the gap between what was true and what he was performing became too wide to hold. My parents chose to believe what felt good over what they could verify, and I chose for a long time to stay quiet and keep building, because I knew that the only thing that would ever be undeniable was the work itself. That's not a religious idea. It's just mechanics. What you actually do accumulates. What you pretend to do eventually runs out of road. I think about Faye sitting across from my brother at that table, calm, document in hand, no drama, just facts, and I think that's actually the thing I'm most proud of from that whole period. Not that I had the money, not that I figured it out. It's that when it mattered, I didn't perform. I just had the facts. I'd been building something real for long enough that when the moment came, I didn't need to say anything big. The paperwork said it. There's a version of this story where I'm bitter, where I go back to that dinner in my head and rehearse what I should have said to my dad, to Nolan, to my sister-in-law with her name tags. I've visited that version. It's not a useful place to live. What I keep coming back to instead is this. The people who underestimate you are often doing you a favor, even if they don't mean to. When no one expects much from you, you get to work without an audience. You get to make mistakes without them being televised. You get to build something quietly, in your own time, at your own pace, without anyone offering opinions about whether you're doing it right. I built 11 properties while my family thought I was just fixing wiring. And honestly, I was fixing wiring. That's also true. The wiring and the properties were never separate things in my mind. One taught me to look at a structure and understand what's holding it up. The other gave me something real to hold. My dad asked me to walk him through the math. That was the beginning of something. Not a perfect relationship. We're still figuring out what that looks like, but an honest one. An honest one is worth more. The deal I'm closing next month is the 14th. I'll do the electrical panel myself, and I'll do it without a name tag.